Hey everyone, welcome to this lesson on the example strategy. So far we've covered two strategies to help us develop the ideas in our writing. We've covered narration and description. So today we're going to cover example. So in a narrative essay, that strategy of description works especially well because it helps bring that narrative to life for the reader. So for the next essay we have coming up, which is the definition essay, strategies like example and comparison contrast work especially well in it. But you could include any combination of strategies. You could use narration again in a part of your essay, you could use cause and effect. So last week we briefly went over all 9 rhetorical strategies using the strategies reading and that matching activity, and also plus that handout or infographic giving examples of all the different strategies. So that gave us a quick overview of each one. So now we're going to slow things down a little bit and look more closely at the example strategy. So why use examples in our writing? When you really think about it, we use examples all the time, even in daily conversation. So let's say, for example, you ask me, what kind of movies do you like? I'll say, oh, I like watching horror movies. And you'll ask me, oh, what kind of horror movies? And maybe I'll say, oh, The Conjuring or The Nun. So those movie titles that I'm giving you, those are examples of the type of horror movies that I like. Right? So examples help us explain what we mean, and they make our ideas easier for others to understand. They're a natural part of how we communicate and clarify our thoughts. Author Malcolm Gladwell calls examples thin slicing. So examples provide a thin slice of information that is typical or representative of the whole pie. That means we use one small clear piece of something to represent that bigger thing or bigger idea. So when we use examples, they should reflect the idea we're trying to explain. That one slice of pie, which is your example, should be able to represent the rest of that pie. So why else do we use examples? Examples also help explain abstract ideas, things like courage, fear, creativity, by making them more real and concrete for your reader. When we think about things like love, courage, fear, those things are not concrete, as in we can't sense them or touch them or feel them. And so they're abstract. But we can make them things that we can see, touch, or feel. We can make them more concrete by using examples. So, just like when we went over the description strategy, examples can also help make an idea more concrete. It shows us what love looks like, what courage looks like, rather than just simply telling us. So here's a kind of fun example from The Simpsons, right? If you never watched it, Homer Simpson, he works at a nuclear power plant, and in front of him, at his workplace, it says, "Don't forget, you're here forever." But he's covered up that sign with pictures of his daughter Maggie, and now it says, "Do it for her." So in this TV show, in this clip, we see a concrete example of love rather than them just telling us, "Oh, Homer loves his daughter so much." Examples also help us narrow down the everything to the something more specific. So instead of talking about something in general terms or being so broad, examples help narrow it down. So if you say, "I love eating delicious tomorrow food," it's too general. It could be anything that's on that fiesta table there, right? The reader doesn't know what specifically you like to eat. So in their mind, they can't really picture anything. So examples help us make that specific. So instead of saying, "I love eating delicious Chamorro food," you could say, "I love eating Tanala Chutney." So how do we start developing the ideas in our writing using examples? So for example, let's say I say that Mulan is a courageous, strong woman. But how do we know and prove that she embodies these qualities? Well, we would cite examples of her courage and strength, specific examples. So, for example, Mulan disguised herself as a man to take her father's place in the war, and that was something that she if she got caught, she could have been punished for, right? She defied these gender expectations. She hid herself as a man, joined an army camp with other men, right? She trained every day without giving up. She fought in a real battle with the Huns, and even after she was exposed, she still stood up to defend the Emperor of China. So here we have examples that support and clarify our statement that we believe Mulan to be a strong, courageous woman. And of course, in our writing, we always have to think about audience. So if you're writing for, let's say, a general audience, you may need to provide more background information or more basic examples of the point you're trying to make or the idea you're trying to convey. If your audience is unfamiliar with your topic, you would have to provide even more examples because they might not have the background knowledge to fully understand your point. Something to think about is that not all examples are created equal. So here's an example. Contrary to popular belief, the social media app TikTok consists of a variety of excellent educational content. There are different categories of TikToks that are informative and present subjects for both young teens and adults. The information offered by these educational TikTok channels make it well worth it to download the app. So, based on this description, do you know what type of educational content is on TikTok? Most likely not, right? Because this example is too vague. You could be thinking of anything. You could maybe think, oh, are they talking about, those dance videos where they show you how to do a specific dance? It could even be cat videos. The point is, the reader has to guess because the example isn't very clear. So here is a much more specific example. With this example, there's no question as to the type of educational content that TikTok has. I've included 3 real life examples of 3 TikTok users and the type of educational content that they provide. This is your goal when writing with examples. There are 3 types of ways you can use examples. The first type is the series example, which is like a list of examples in sentence format. The example I just showed you previously with the educational content on TikTok, that is an example of a series example. So in a series example, the examples are specific and you don't develop it beyond 1 sentence each that explains that example. In this series example paragraph, there are 3 specific examples, and none of those examples are developed beyond 1 sentence. This is what we call a series example because you're giving a series of examples within that paragraph. If we were to outline that previous series example, this is what it might look like. So the main idea or the point that we're trying to convey is that Hollywood stars, they tend to adopt stage names. And so I have 3 examples here, and each example was not developed beyond 1 sentence each. The second type of example we can use is the 2-in-1 example. This is when we choose 2 examples and we explain each example with more detail in a paragraph. So we could spend more than a sentence on each example, but we only go into detail with 2. Here's an example of a 2-in-1 example. Notice how well developed each example is. The author gives you enough detail to understand what their family dog Pepper does when she wants to get attention. So an outline for that 2-in-1 example might look like this. So the main idea or point we're trying to show or convey is that these are the things Pepper does when she doesn't get enough attention. The first example is the toilet paper trick, and then the second example is the cat sit trick. And we went into more detail with what she does for each of those examples. The last type of example you can use is the extended example. So this is just one example, but it's long and very detailed. It could even be a personal example, so it could be a personal story or narrative, right? But basically, that extended example supports your overall point that you're trying to make or your thesis. And here's an example of the extended example. And here's what that extended example would look like if it were made into an outline. So the main point I'm trying to make is that seatbelts prevent injury. So here are all the details that I included from points A to F. So what makes strong examples? First, the examples you use should be relevant. They should always support or clarify or explain the point you're trying to make. Also think about whether or not the audience can relate to your examples. Next, think about quality. The examples you use should be well chosen. So select only the strongest or the most convincing examples. So ask yourself, are they current? Will the audience be able to relate to them? And are they persuasive? Also think about quantity. You want to select enough examples to persuade and make each point clear. So put yourself in the reader's place. Would you be convinced by the amount of examples provided? They should be enough to support your main points adequately. Lastly, think about range and representation. The examples you choose should fairly and accurately represent what you're trying to say, and they should represent the rest of that pie. So remember, thin slicing. Your examples have to be thin slices of that overall pie. So let's say you are trying to write a paper about the health benefits of swimming. You wouldn't use Michael Phelps as an example in your paper because Michael Phelps is not a representative example of all swimmers. He's an Olympic swimmer. He's very amazing in what he does. So he doesn't represent the whole pie of average swimmers. So he would not be a good example to use in that paper. Yay, we made it to the end. So, in other words, examples should be clear, specific, adequately detailed, and accurately represent the point you're trying to make. You need to persuade your readers with each example that you give. You can give real life, real world examples, you can give personal examples. The point is, you want your readers to see rather than you simply telling them. So, show, don't always tell.